My name is Sarah Whitfield. I am 41 years old, and for the last 2 years of my mother's life, I was the only one of her 3 children who showed up more than twice a month. I want to say that without bitterness, because for most of that time I didn't think of it as a competition. I thought of it as simply what you do when the person who raised you is dying slowly of congestive heart failure and can no longer trust her own legs on the stairs. But on a Tuesday afternoon in March, in a hospice room that smelled like lavender hand lotion and rubbing alcohol, my sister turned that quiet, unspoken arrangement into a weapon, and I learned exactly how far she was willing to go to protect the version of herself she had built for everyone else to see. I was sitting beside my mother's bed when it happened. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, and she had been moved into home hospice care 6 weeks earlier, after her 3rd hospital admission in 4 months made it clear that further treatment wasn't going to change the outcome, only delay it. The hospice agency had set up a hospital bed in what used to be her sewing room, facing the window so she could watch the dogwood tree in the backyard, the one my father had planted the year I was born. She liked to watch it lose its blossoms in the wind. She said it looked like snow that wasn't cold. That afternoon, she reached for my hand and asked me something that stopped my breath in my chest. "Sarah, honey, why did you stop helping with the money? Diane said you told her you were done contributing." I remember the exact texture of the blanket under my other hand, a soft yellow chenille one my mother had owned since before I could remember. I remember the particular angle of afternoon light coming through the blinds. I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that I needed to keep my voice steady, because my mother's heart was failing, and the last thing she needed in the time she had left was to watch her daughters tear into each other over her hospital bed. "I never said that, Mom," I told her. "I've never stopped." She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the confusion in her face, the effort it took her to hold 2 conflicting stories in her mind at once. Then she patted my hand, the way she used to when I was small and had scraped a knee, and said, "Well, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding then," and closed her eyes to rest. I sat there for another 20 minutes, watching her chest rise and fall, before I let myself leave the room and step out onto the back porch, where I finally took out my phone. My sister Diane is 3 years older than me. She lives in Charlotte, about 4 hours from our mother's house in the small town outside Raleigh where we grew up, while I had stayed close, only 20 minutes away, in a rental house I'd moved into after my divorce 2 years earlier. Our brother Marcus lives in Ohio and calls twice a month if you're lucky. For most of my adult life, I had accepted this arrangement without much resentment. Diane had a demanding job in commercial real estate, 2 teenagers with competing sports schedules, and a husband who traveled constantly for work. I understood that proximity made me the natural default caregiver, and honestly, some part of me didn't mind it. I liked being useful to my mother. I liked the quiet hours we spent together, folding laundry, watching old movies, talking about nothing in particular. What I minded, when I finally let myself think about it clearly that afternoon on the porch, was the 15 months during which Diane had been telling anyone who would listen that she was the one holding our family together financially, while I sat by, apparently unwilling to help. I texted her first, because I wanted to give her the chance to explain herself before I assumed the worst. "Diane. Hey, is everything okay? Mom mentioned something odd." She didn't respond for almost 3 hours. When she finally did, her message arrived without any acknowledgement of what I'd actually asked. "Diane, I never said that. You're misremembering what I told her. This is exactly why I don't like discussing money around Mom. She gets confused and then everyone panics." I stared at that message for a long time. My mother had congestive heart failure, not dementia. Her mind, until the very last week of her life, remained sharp enough to argue with me about whether I was parking my car too close to the mailbox. Calling her confused was not an explanation. It was a redirection, The kind Diane had been using on me since we were teenagers, whenever she wanted to make a problem disappear without actually addressing it. I typed back a single question. Sarah, what exactly did you tell her about the money, Diane? 10 minutes later, my brother joined the conversation, which told me Diane had looped him in the moment she saw my message land. Marcus, can we not do this right now? Mom doesn't need to hear us fighting about money while she's this sick. I remember reading that text while standing in my mother's kitchen, next to the calendar on the refrigerator, where she still wrote down her medication schedule in her small, careful handwriting, even though the hospice nurse had taken over most of that responsibility weeks earlier. Marcus's message wasn't wrong, exactly. My mother didn't need to hear us fighting, but that wasn't what I was doing. I was trying to understand why my mother had just asked me, with genuine hurt in her voice, why I had abandoned her. Sarah, I agree Mom shouldn't hear us fighting. That's exactly why I need to understand why she thinks I stopped helping, when I haven't missed a payment in 15 months. Diane's response came fast this time, faster than anything else she'd sent that day, and it had a different tone entirely, sharper, more personal. Diane, you've always been jealous of how close Mom and I are. This isn't about money. It's about you needing to feel like the martyr in this family. I'm not doing this with you today. I sat down at my mother's kitchen table and read that message 3 times. Jealous. That was the word Diane reached for whenever she wanted to end a conversation she couldn't win honestly. It was the word she'd used when I got into the state university's honors program, and the word she'd used when my ex-husband and I bought our first house before she and her husband bought theirs. The word she used any time the facts didn't support the story she wanted to tell about herself. But I had learned, over 4 decades of being her younger sister, that the way to handle Diane was never to argue with her framing in the moment. Arguing only gave her more material to work with, more ways to paint herself as the reasonable one being attacked by an emotional, resentful sibling. The way to handle Diane was to gather what you needed quietly and let the facts do the talking when you were ready. So that's what I did. To understand why my mother's question hit me the way it did, you have to understand what our family looked like long before any of this started. My parents divorced when I was 14, Diane was 17, and Marcus was 11. My father moved to Tennessee not long after and, over time, became more of a name on a birthday card than an actual presence in our lives. My mother raised the 3 of us mostly alone, working full-time as a school bookkeeper while somehow still making it to every parent-teacher conference and every school play, even the ones where I had exactly 1 line and stood in the back row of a chorus. Diane, as the oldest, had always occupied a particular role in our house, the responsible one, the one my mother leaned on when she needed help managing the younger 2 of us. That role came with real burdens. I want to be fair about that, and I don't think Diane's childhood was easy. But it also came with a kind of narrative authority that she never fully let go of as an adult. Diane was the one who got to describe what had happened in any given situation, and the rest of us, including our mother, tended to accept her version first and ask questions later if we asked them at all. I remember a specific moment from when I was around 26, a few years before my mother's health became a serious concern, that I think about often now. My mother had needed help repainting her house before putting it on the market to downsize, and all 3 of us had agreed to split the cost of hiring painters. When the bill came in higher than expected, Diane told our mother that she'd covered the difference herself, out of generosity, without mentioning it to me or Marcus. It wasn't until months later, going through some paperwork with my mother, that I found the actual invoice and realized the overage had been split evenly among the 3 of us after all, the same as originally planned. Diane had simply claimed credit for something that hadn't actually happened the way she described it. My enhamdod binnen, and that it let it go. It felt too small to fight about, and I told myself I was being petty for even noticing. Looking back, I think that was the first version of the same pattern I would eventually see play out on a much larger, much more consequential scale during our mother's final year. Diane wasn't managing money so much as she was managing perception, carefully curating the story of who she was to the people whose good opinion mattered most to her. And our mother's good opinion mattered more to Diane than almost anything else in her life. I want to back up here and explain how the money actually worked, because it matters for what came next. When our mother's health began declining seriously, about 2 years before that afternoon in the hospice room, the three of us had a phone call, the only real family meeting we ever had about it, where we agreed to split the cost of her in-home care equally. At the time, before hospice took over, she needed a part-time aide to help her with bathing, meals, and medication management, along with the modifications to the house, a walk-in shower, grab bars, a stair lift that alone cost close to $4,000 installed. The total monthly cost, once everything was accounted for, came to just under $3,200. Split 3 ways, that was roughly $1,067 each, though we'd rounded it to an even $1,000 from each of us, with the difference coming out of Mom's modest savings. I set up an automatic transfer from my checking account to hers on the 1st of every month. I never missed one. Not once, not even the month I was laid off from my marketing job and had to dip into my emergency fund to cover it. Not even the month my car transmission failed and I put the repair on a credit card rather than skip the transfer. What I didn't know, until that afternoon on the porch, was what Diane had apparently been telling our mother, and possibly other relatives, about her own contributions and mine. The one she used mostly for solitaire and video calls with her sister in Florida, but which she'd also used, out of old habit, to log into her bank account and check her balance the way she'd done every week for 40 years, long before online banking made it easy. I knew her passwords because I managed her bills for her. I opened the account and started scrolling back through 15 months of transaction history. Every single one of my transfers was there, dated, itemized, exactly $1,000 on the 1st of the month, 15 times in a row. Diane's transfers were there too, for the first 4 months. Then they simply stopped. I sat very still in my mother's kitchen for a long moment, looking at that gap in the record, the abrupt silence where Diane's contributions should have continued. I want to be honest and say that my first reaction wasn't anger. It was something closer to grief, a specific kind of grief for the version of my sister I had apparently been giving credit for 11 months of financial support she hadn't actually provided, while somehow also being cast, in her retelling, as the sibling who'd abandoned our mother. I called the bank the next morning, not to accuse anyone, but because I needed to understand the full picture before I said anything else to my sister. My mother had given me power of attorney over her finances 8 months earlier, once it became clear she'd need help managing things as her health declined, so I had every legal right to request a complete transaction history rather than just what was visible in her online portal. The woman at the branch printed out 6 months of statements for me, going back further than what I'd already seen online, and I sat in the parking lot afterward and read every line.
Hello.
The picture that emerged was more complicated, and in some ways worse, than a simple missed payment. Diane hadn't just stopped contributing. 4 months after her transfers stopped, a new pattern began. Withdrawals from our mother's account, not large, not obviously suspicious on any individual line. $200 here, $350 there, always described in the memo line as things like Mom's birthday gift, or flowers for Mom, or on one occasion that made my hands go cold, reimbursement, gas for hospital visits. I did the math sitting in that parking lot. Over 11 months, Diane had withdrawn just over $4,000 from our mother's account, money that was meant to cover care costs, while telling our mother that I was the one who had stopped helping. I did not confront her that day. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters to understand that what I did next wasn't an impulsive act of revenge. It took me another 9 days to gather everything I needed. I printed 6 months of full statements from the bank, not just screenshots from an app that could be dismissed as confusing or incomplete. I highlighted every one of my transfers in yellow and every one of Diane's withdrawals in a different color, so the pattern would be immediately visible to anyone looking at the page, including someone who might not be inclined to look closely. I made 3 copies, one for myself, one I planned to give to my brother, and one I intended to bring to my mother, though I hadn't yet decided exactly how or when I would do that. Night of Emerald. During those 9 days, my mother's condition worsened. The hospice nurse began coming twice a day instead of once. My mother slept more, and when she was awake, she tired quickly, her sentences trailing off mid-thought in a way that terrified me more than anything else about her decline. I knew, in the way you know these things without anyone saying it out loud, that I didn't have unlimited time to decide what to do with what I'd found. Diane came to visit on a Saturday, 10 days after that first conversation, driving down from Charlotte with her husband and one of her teenage sons. I hadn't told her I knew about the withdrawals. I hadn't told anyone except, briefly, a close friend from work, who listened to the whole story over coffee and told me, gently, that I needed to decide what outcome I actually wanted before I said anything to my sister, because facts alone rarely change people who have already decided what story they're going to tell about themselves. I thought about that conversation a lot in the days that followed. When Diane arrived, she was warm and performative in the way she always was around our mother, adjusting pillows, refilling water glasses, narrating small tender gestures in a voice pitched slightly louder than necessary, as if she wanted to make sure everyone in the house registered how attentive she was being. My mother's face lit up when she saw her, the particular unguarded happiness she reserved for Diane, and I felt the old familiar sting of it, the one I'd felt my whole childhood watching my mother's eyes follow my older sister across a room in a way they never quite followed me. I let that visit pass without saying anything. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, though if I'm honest, I think part of me was still hoping I wouldn't have to say anything at all, that somehow the situation would resolve itself, that Diane would quietly start contributing again, and the gap in the record would become irrelevant. That hope ended 2 weeks later, on the day my mother asked me, for the second time, why I had stopped helping. This time we were alone in the room, just the 2 of us, my mother propped up against 3 pillows because lying flat had become uncomfortable for her breathing. The hospice nurse had left 20 minutes earlier. The afternoon light was doing the same thing it had done that first day, slanting gold through the blinds, catching the dust in the air. Diane said you 2 talked, my mother said, her voice thin but clear. She said you admitted you'd been struggling and just stopped paying your share, and she didn't want to make you feel bad about it, so she's been covering the difference herself. I felt something settle in me then, a kind of stillness that wasn't calm exactly, but was very close to it. I understood, finally, exactly what story Diane had constructed, and how carefully she had built it to be unfalsifiable in casual conversation. She hadn't accused me of anything cruel. She had framed herself as protecting me, covering for me out of sisterly kindness, which made any denial on my part look small and defensive, like I was refusing to accept her generosity. "Mom," I said, "can I show you something? I don't want to upset you, and if you'd rather not look at it right now, we don't have to. But I don't want you to keep believing something that isn't true." She nodded, curious rather than alarmed, and I retrieved the folder I'd left in my car that morning, the one I'd been carrying around for almost 3 weeks without using. I sat on the edge of her bed and walked her through it slowly, page by page. I showed her my transfers first, 15 months of them, unbroken, dated, easy to follow. Then I showed her Diane's, the 4 months of contributions, followed by the sudden stop. Then I showed her the withdrawals, the birthday gifts and the flowers and the gas reimbursements, adding them up out loud so she could hear the total. I want to say that I read every line to her calmly, without editorializing, without adding commentary about what I thought it meant. I didn't need to. My mother had run a household budget for 30 years before she retired from her job as a school bookkeeper. She understood exactly what she was looking at. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Long enough that I started to worry I'd made a mistake, that I'd traded her comfort for my own need to be believed. Then she reached over and took my hand, and I saw that her eyes were wet. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have asked to see the numbers myself, instead of just believing what I was told." That was all she said about it that day. She was too tired for more, and I didn't push her. But I could see something had shifted in her, a kind of clarity settling over her features that hadn't been there before, and I understood that whatever came next between my mother and my sister was no longer something I needed to manage or explain. My mother had the facts now. What she chose to do with them was hers to decide. What she chose to do, it turned out, was call Diane that evening, while I sat in the next room pretending to read a magazine I wasn't actually reading. I couldn't hear the specifics of the conversation, only the rise and fall of my mother's voice, quieter and steadier than I expected, not raised in anger, but also not softened by the usual deference she showed my sister. It lasted almost 20 minutes. My phone started buzzing about 10 minutes after that call ended. "Diane, what did you show her? What did you say to Mom?" "Diane den arbes of feinetjend. Would I in one for Simon? Jodin, Magod, Yeoman for Simon," and only then picked up my phone. "Sarah," I showed her the bank statements. All of them. She asked to see them, so I showed her. "Diane, you had no right to go digging through her accounts like that. That's an invasion of her privacy and yours." I looked at that message for a moment, struck by the strangeness of being accused of invading privacy by the person who had spent 11 months withdrawing money from an account she wasn't contributing to. "Sarah, I have power of attorney, Diane. I've had it for 8 months. I'm not digging through anything I don't have every legal right to see." There was a longer pause after that, long enough that I wondered if she'd stopped responding entirely. Then the messages started coming faster, less composed than before. "Diane, you're going to destroy this family over $4,000? Do you understand how that looks, turning Mom against me while she's dying?" "Sarah, I didn't turn her against anyone. I showed her the truth. What she does with it is up to her." "Diane, delete whatever you showed her, please. I'll figure out a way to pay it back. Just don't let this be the last thing she remembers about me." I sat with that message for a long time before I responded. There was something in the shift, the sudden appearance of the word please, a word I couldn't remember Diane using with me in years, that told me more clearly than anything else in the entire exchange how much this had actually cost her. Not the money, but the version of herself she'd built for our mother to believe in. I didn't delete anything. I didn't respond with anger either, though I won't pretend I wasn't tempted to. I wrote back one sentence, and then I put my phone away for the rest of the night. "Sarah, I'm not going to lie to Mom for you. Not now, not with the time she has left." The hospice nurse, a calm, unflappable woman named Patricia, who had been coming to the house nearly every day for 2 months by then, was in the kitchen when my mother made that phone call to Diane, checking supplies against a clipboard list. She didn't say anything about it. Professionally, she wouldn't have, but later that week, as she was packing up her bag to leave, she paused at the door and told me, in the careful, understated way hospice workers seem to develop after years of witnessing families at their most exposed, that she'd seen a lot of families go through exactly this kind of reckoning in the final weeks. She said it happened more often than people would expect, this sudden clarity that arrives when someone realizes how little time is actually left, and that in her experience, the families who addressed things honestly, even painfully, tended to carry less regret afterward than the ones who let everything stay buried for the sake of a temporary peace. I don't know if she meant that as reassurance or simply as an observation, but I held on to it in the weeks that followed, in the moments when I doubted whether I'd made the right choice showing my mother those statements. Shamalander, My mother lived for another 5 weeks after that conversation. I won't pretend those weeks were easy, or that everything between my sister and me was somehow resolved by one difficult exchange of text messages. Diane didn't come to visit as often after that, though she did come, twice more, and both times she was quieter, less performative, as if some of the certainty had gone out of her. She never apologized to me directly, not in so many words, but she did start transferring money again. First a lump sum to cover what she'd missed, and then monthly, alongside mine and Marcus's, for the remaining weeks that our mother needed care. Marcus, for his part, never fully addressed what had happened, but he did start calling our mother more often in those final weeks, sometimes just for 10 minutes, sometimes staying on the phone until she fell asleep. I don't know if that was guilt, or grief accelerating, or something else entirely. I've stopped trying to assign a single motive to any of it. My mother died on a Thursday morning in early May, with me holding one of her hands and a hospice aide quietly adjusting the oxygen line beside her. Diane arrived 4 hours too late, having left Charlotte the moment she got my call, but hitting traffic on the interstate that no one could have predicted. I remember standing in the driveway when she finally pulled up, watching her get out of the car and understanding, in a way I hadn't quite let myself before, that grief doesn't erase the things that happened before it. It just sits alongside them. At the funeral, an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years pulled me aside and told me she'd heard I'd been the one holding everything together at the end, the appointments, the paperwork, the daily visits. I don't know exactly what version of events had reached her, or through what channel, but I didn't correct her or elaborate. I simply said that we'd all done what we could, which was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Marcus spoke at the service, a short, halting eulogy about our mother's stubbornness and her habit of remembering everyone's birthday without ever writing it down, and afterwards standing near the coat check with a paper cup of coffee neither of us drank. He told me he was sorry he hadn't paid closer attention sooner, that he'd let himself believe whatever version of events was easiest to hear from 4 states away because it required nothing further from him. I told him I appreciated him saying it, and I meant that, though I also understood it as the kind of apology that changes very little about the years that came before it. Diane didn't offer anything similar, not that day, and not in the months that followed. What I got instead, in the years since, has been a quieter, more distant version of my sister. One who still sends a card at Christmas and still calls on my birthday, but who has never once brought up that spring directly, as if by unspoken agreement, we've both decided it belongs to a part of our history neither of us wants to excavate again. I think about that folder sometimes, sitting in a drawer in my house now, the highlighted statements, the careful documentation of 11 months of a story that wasn't true. I didn't build it to punish my sister. I built it because I couldn't stand the idea of my mother spending her final months believing I had abandoned her, when the truth was that I had shown up every single time, in every way I knew how, including the one time it mattered most, when I finally had to show her the numbers instead of just my word. People sometimes ask me, when I tell this story, whether I regret confronting Diane the way I did, whether there was a gentler path I could have taken that wouldn't have strained things between us during our mother's final weeks. I've thought about that question honestly more than once, and I keep arriving at the same answer. The strain wasn't something I created by showing my mother the truth. It was already there, built quietly over 11 months by someone who assumed no one would ever check the records closely enough to notice. What I chose in the end wasn't revenge. It was simply refusing to let a lie stand between my mother and the truth about who had actually been there, in the only currency that mattered by that point, which wasn't affection or performance, but time, attention, and the quiet, unglamorous work of showing up when no one else was watching. If you've ever had to prove something to the people who were supposed to already know it about you, I think you understand exactly what that folder meant to me. Not a weapon, just the truth, finally allowed to speak for itself. If this story means something to you, or reminds you of a version of your own family, I'd like to know what you would have done in my place. Would you have shown your mother the records or found a quieter way to let it go, for the sake of the time you had left together?